Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper, beginning with an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. This article refers to the horrific chemical industrial disaster that took place yesterday near Visakhapatnam. A toxic gas leaked out at the polymer manufacturing facility of LG located near Visakhapatnam, resulting in the death of nearly 11 people, and hundreds of them have been hospitalized, many of them in critical condition. According to initial reports, this disaster was caused by the leakage of a toxic gas known as styrene, and reportedly it spread over a radius of 3 kilometers around the polymer manufacturing facility. Horrific reports have emerged from the affected area, and they show how the victims who were exposed to the toxic gas suffered from breathlessness, they were nauseated, they felt dizzy and confused, and many of them fell unconscious on the road. According to reports, there was a lot of panic in the neighborhood, and a number of people lost their lives even before they could be taken to the hospital. This industrial disaster highlights the traumatic impact of a chemical disaster, and it is a stark reminder of the world's worst industrial tragedy, that is the Bhopal gas disaster of 1984. In fact, this was not the only industrial disaster that India went through yesterday. In total, there were 3 industrial disasters reported across the country, and all of them could be tied to the impact of the lockdown. Apart from the gas leak at Vizag, there was another case of gas leak at an industrial facility in Chhattisgarh, and there was a boiler blast at the Neyveli thermal power plant in Tamil Nadu. All these industrial disasters could possibly be tied to the impact of the lockdown. See, as a result of the lockdown, industrial activity across the country had come to a standstill, including the operation of hazardous industrial facilities. The prolonged lockdown, which has lasted for more than 40 days, has affected the maintenance and servicing of industrial equipment, especially the industrial equipment at hazardous industrial facilities. It could be possible that maintenance and servicing issues could have caused these industrial disasters, including the chemical disaster at Vizag. Now let us talk about the toxic gas that is responsible for this disaster. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention of the United States, styrene gas is a neurotoxin, and it can affect our central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system when we are exposed to the toxic gas. Studies have shown that when you inhale styrene gas, it can cause tiredness, it can cause inebriation, it can induce nausea and slow down your reaction time, it can affect your ability to concentrate, and it can cause problems to your body balance, to your motor abilities, and it can even change your color vision. According to CDC and the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States, studies have shown that styrene gas can affect human beings and as well as animals in 3 different ways, depending upon the duration of exposure and depending upon the concentration of the gas that one is exposed to. These studies have shown that short-term exposure to styrene gas can cause irritation of the mucous membranes present in the eye and the lung, and this can result in respiratory issues such as breathlessness. Such short-term exposure in lower concentration levels can even cause gastrointestinal issues. But the impact of this toxic gas on our central nervous system will cause nausea, headache, fatigue, weakness, and confusion. Studies have also established that chronic exposure or long-term exposure to styrene gas can have a severe impact on our nervous system. This in turn can lead to memory impairment, it can affect our motor abilities, it can cause loss of hearing, and as well as peripheral neuropathy. Studies have also shown that styrene gas is a carcinogen, and long-term chronic exposure can even lead to cancer. But we do not have sufficient scientific studies that evaluate the impact of acute exposure to styrene gas. A few studies have shown that acute exposure to styrene gas, that is when you are exposed to very high concentration of styrene gas in a short period, it can cause inebriation, nausea, headache, etc. But it is not clear whether such acute exposure in a short period can be fatal. There has been no scientific study conducted to establish that acute exposure to styrene gas can result in death. Hence, we cannot assume that the deaths that have occurred at Vizag is because of styrene gas. This chemical disaster could have occurred because of a chemical reaction involving styrene gas and few other toxic chemicals as well. So the exact cause of this chemical disaster can be established only through a thorough investigation. And for the time being, experts are suspecting that styrene gas could be the cause behind this disaster. Now let us look at the response of the disaster management authorities to this incident. As soon as the disaster took place, the National Disaster Response Force was mobilized and the 10th Battalion of the NDRF deployed its specialized CBRN teams in order to carry out rescue and relief operations as a part of the immediate response. See, CBRN refers to a category of man-made disasters. It includes chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear disasters. These disasters could be caused because of industrial accidents, because of a terror attack or sabotage, and it could also be an outcome of war. Considering the large-scale impact and traumatic nature of these disasters, you need dedicated teams that have received specialized training and carry specialized equipment in order to respond to these disasters. So for this reason, dedicated CBRN teams have been set up within NDRF battalions. We have 12 battalions of the NDRF as of now, and most of the battalions have a dedicated CBRN unit which have received specialized training and they carry specialized equipment in order to respond to these CBRN disasters. So as soon as the disaster occurred, within a few hours, the CBRN teams of the 10th Battalion of NDRF were deployed in order to evacuate the people and provide for rescue and relief operations in the affected region. As soon as the scale of the disaster became evident, the National Disaster Management Authority, which is headed by the Prime Minister, and the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is the nodal authority to respond to such disasters, convened emergency meetings in order to review the rescue operations. The NDMA and the National Executive Committee that have been established under the Disaster Management Act, along with the MHA, even arranged for the airlift of a chemical from Gujarat to Vizag in order to neutralize the gas and prevent any further leakage. The district level disaster management authorities responded as per established protocol, and they provided for rescue and relief by coordinating with the state level and the national level disaster management authorities. And as per the established legal framework for dealing with chemical disasters, the local police have registered multiple cases under the Indian Penal Code against the management of the polymer manufacturing facility. Now let us understand why industrial disasters, especially chemical disasters, have been given special priority under India's disaster management plans. See, chemical disasters are considered to be extremely dangerous because of its large-scale impact and traumatic impact. When toxic and hazardous chemicals are released in a sudden manner, either because of an accident or either deliberately, then it can have a huge impact on living organisms, on the environment, and as well as on property. The leakage of hazardous chemicals can cause death and injury amongst human beings, plants, and as well as animals. It can even lead to chronic diseases in the long term, and it can even cause permanent disability. Then on the environment side, the leakage of hazardous chemicals can result in the introduction of these toxic substances into our soil system, our water bodies, and the atmosphere, resulting in long-term pollution, which again will have a long-term health impact on the living organisms. Such chemical disasters can even cause large-scale damage to property, including houses, public infrastructure, critical infrastructure, industrial facilities, etc. So in short, chemical disasters, be it accidental or deliberate, they tend to have a short-term and long-term impact, and due to its ability to cause large-scale damage and inflict trauma and immense suffering on human beings and animals, dedicated disaster management plans will have to be drawn up. So accordingly, chemical disasters have been listed as a traumatic disaster on the website of the National Disaster Management Authority, and very high priority has been given for chemical disasters under India's Disaster Management Plan and Disaster Management Policy as mandated by the Disaster Management Act of 2005. The NDMA has recognized the traumatic impact and long-term impact that chemical disasters can have on human beings, on the environment, and as well as on property. The NDMA has identified that those who are at the highest risk of suffering from a chemical disaster include the industrial units, its employees and workers, vehicles that transport hazardous chemicals, the people who reside in settlements around these hazardous industrial units, adjacent buildings, the occupants of these buildings, and the surrounding community. The NDMA has also identified a number of ways through which chemical disasters can occur, either through accident or either through deliberate acts. Chemical disasters could occur because of failure in the implementation of standard protocols and safety systems. Such failures could occur either because of human errors, technical errors, or due to errors or negligence on the part of the management. This could be the most probable reason behind the Vizag gas leak incident, and this would be soon established through a thorough investigation. Then chemical disasters could also be induced through natural disasters. For example, an earthquake or a cyclone or a tsunami could destroy or damage industrial facilities that are storing and handling hazardous chemicals, leading to their accidental leakage, and thus natural calamities can also induce chemical disasters. Next, chemical disasters could also occur when vehicles that are transporting hazardous chemicals meet with accidents. Such disasters could also take place when hazardous chemicals are not processed or disposed in a scientific manner. Then chemical disasters could also be caused deliberately, either through terrorist attacks, through sabotage, which can occur during riots or unrest. It can also occur in chemical warfare when chemical weapons are used in violation of international law. And it can also occur in conventional wars when hazardous industrial units are targeted by the other side. So in order to ensure that India is in a position to prevent such chemical disasters and ensure that India is adequately prepared to mitigate and respond to such chemical disasters, dedicated disaster management plan, policy and guidelines have been drawn up by the NDMA. The NDMA recognizes that India has already gone through the world's worst chemical disaster, that is the Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984. It recognizes the immense damage and suffering that chemical disasters can cause to human lives and as well as to environment. Through this disaster management plan, the NDMA has identified India's vulnerability to chemical disasters, and it has identified thousands of hazardous chemical industrial units that are located across the country and the potential risk that they are facing. This disaster management plan and guidelines put in place a number of safety initiatives in order to ensure that India is adequately prepared to deal with a chemical disaster. The NDMA, along with the Government of India, has put in place a comprehensive legal and institutional framework that provides for the regulation of safe transportation and handling of hazardous chemicals, liability, insurance and compensation in the event of a chemical disaster. These provisions dealing with chemical disaster management have been covered through various legislations, including the Explosives Act, the Factories Act, the Environment Protection Act, the Public Liability Insurance Act, the Petroleum Act, the Insecticides Act, the Motor Vehicles Act, of course the Disaster Management Act, and the Indian Penal Code. In order to enforce this legal framework, the NDMA and the Government of India have come out with a set of rules and guidelines, including the gas cylinder rules, the hazardous waste rules, the dock workers rules, etc. In fact, the NDMA has come out with very specific guidelines for chemical disaster management, and it has a set of separate guidelines for dealing with chemical disasters caused by industrial accidents and terrorism. Next, in a related editorial on page number 6, The Hindu provides for an evaluation of this chemical disaster. The editorial first expresses shock at the horrific and traumatic suffering that has been inflicted by this disaster, and it points out that the disaster could have taken place as a result of the lockdown. As we discussed, the prolonged lockdown has affected the maintenance and servicing schedules in industrial units, and as industries are trying to resume their operations, we could be staring at the possibility of increasing number of industrial accidents. The editorial calls upon the government to evaluate whether a more calibrated exit from the lockdown has to be worked out in order to ensure that such industrial accidents do not occur. See, the toxic gas that has been suspected to be responsible for this disaster, that is styrene, has already been listed as a scheduled hazardous chemical under the Hazardous Chemical Rules of 1989. This designation allows the Government of India to completely regulate the manufacture, the storage, the handling and the import of styrene. But since the disaster has taken place, despite this strict regulation, there is an urgent need to carry out a thorough investigation in order to identify the lapses on the part of the management of the industry and as well as on the part of the government authorities, especially at the district and state levels. The editorial hopes that a thorough investigation will identify the cause and the lapses that led to this disaster and help in fixing responsibility and accountability. Then the editorial says that the response of the government should be victim-centric. The government needs to focus on the immediate medical needs of the victims and as well as provide for adequate compensation. Because studies have already established that exposure to styrene can have long-term impact, and since it is also considered to be a carcinogen which could cause cancer, the government is bound to provide for adequate compensation and ensure that the victims have access to quality health care so that both the short-term and long-term medical needs of the victims are met. While talking about the welfare of victims, the editorial says that the government should not repeat the injustice that was done to the victims of Bhopal gas disaster. Because in the case of Bhopal gas disaster, most of the victims failed to receive adequate compensation and till date they are not able to access quality health care. So in the case of Bhopal disaster, gross injustice has been done to the victims because most of the surviving victims still suffer from the long-term impact of the disaster. Then finally, the editorial says that this disaster should be a warning note for other hazardous industries, the Government of India and the state governments, and they need to coordinate with each other in order to work out a safe exit strategy from the lockdown. The editorial also says that all the three tiers of the government, that is the center, the state and the district level authorities, they need to strictly enforce India's disaster management plans with regard to chemical disaster management by keeping in mind public safety and as well as occupational safety. Now let's take up a couple of articles from page number 4 and 10, which helps us understand the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown on labor welfare. See, the government of Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh have introduced a series of reforms to their labor laws in order to revive industrial activity and economic growth, which has seen a complete setback as a result of the lockdown. See, there is no doubt that the lockdown had brought industrial activity to a complete standstill, and economic growth in all the states has declined rapidly. So in order to revive industrial activity and promote economic growth, the government of Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh have decided to amend their labor laws in order to grant exemptions to the industry. The UP government has approved an ordinance which exempts businesses and industries from almost all the labor laws for a period of 3 years, except for the labor laws that deal with the welfare of women and child laborers. It also provides for the continuation of the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act, the Building and Other Construction Workers Act, the Payment of Wages Act, the Workmen Compensation Act, etc. Apart from these laws, all the other labor laws have been suspended for a period of 3 years, and this grants an exemption to businesses and industries, and it helps incentivize industrial growth and employment creation opportunities. Then the Madhya Pradesh government as well has amended a number of labor laws, and it has exempted the enforcement of a number of sections under the Factories Act for a period of 3 months. These changes introduced by the Madhya Pradesh government allows the industries to provide for increased working hours, and it pushes up the working hours from 8 hours to 12 hours per day and allows a total working hours of 72 hours per week. This of course can be implemented by the industries only if the workers are willing to work extra and if they are paid overtime charges. The changes that have been introduced also provides exemptions for the industries from registration and inspections. It also exempts the industries from providing basic healthcare and safety facilities to the employees, such as ventilation, lighting, toilets, canteen facilities, first aid, etc. These changes to labor laws are supposed to make it easier for the industry to manage their labor force and quickly help in reviving industrial activities and economic growth. But on the other hand, these changes that are being introduced by the state governments without much of a debate can have a significant impact on labor welfare, and it might expose the laborers to be exploited by the industries. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, in which the former Chief Election Commissioner of India, S.Y. Qureshi, explains the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the conduct of democratic elections in India. To explain the impact of the pandemic on the conduct of elections, the writer takes the example of the recent constitutional crisis seen in the state of Maharashtra. See, in Maharashtra, we have a coalition government headed by Chief Minister Uddhav Thackeray. But the problem is, Uddhav Thackeray is not a member of the legislature. He is not a member of either the Legislative Assembly or the Legislative Council. But according to Article 164 of the Indian Constitution, members of the Council of Ministers, including the Chief Minister, they have to be a member of the state legislature, that is either the Assembly or the Council. If not, they need to get themselves elected within a period of 6 months, either to the Assembly or the Council, or they should get nominated to the Legislative Council. Failing to do so will result in the loss of their membership from the Council of Ministers, and hence they would be forced to resign. The constitutional deadline for Mr. Uddhav Thackeray to become a member of the state legislature expires on the 27th of May. So he was planning to comfortably get elected to the Legislative Council through the Legislative Council elections that were supposed to be held on the 26th of March. But his plans were turned upside down as a result of the pandemic. As the COVID-19 pandemic spread, the Election Commission of India was forced to postpone the elections by using its powers under Article 324 of the Indian Constitution and the Representation of People's Act in order to abide by the lockdown restrictions and enforce social distancing. So the indefinite cancellation of elections to the Legislative Council left Mr. Uddhav Thackeray with only two options. One was to provide for the double application of Article 164, that is to extend the deadline by 6 months by resigning as the Chief Minister and by getting sworn in again as the Chief Minister in order to extend the deadline by 6 months. But such a hack to bypass the Constitution has been disallowed by the Supreme Court in the S.R. Chowdhury vs. State of Punjab case. In this landmark case, the Supreme Court ruled that double application of Article 164 through the resignation and swearing in of the member is unconstitutional because it amounts to the subversion of the Constitution and the principle of representative government. So the second option for Uddhav Thackeray was to get himself nominated to the Legislative Council as per the provisions of Article 171, because this article allows the governor of the state to nominate members to the Legislative Council provided if they have special knowledge or practical experience in few fields such as science, sports, literature, etc. But the proposal to nominate Uddhav Thackeray was held up by the governor since Uddhav Thackeray does not fall under any of the special categories mentioned under Article 171. So this standoff between the governor and the state government of Maharashtra was threatening to turn into a constitutional crisis. But thanks to the intervention of Prime Minister Modi and the Election Commission of India, this constitutional crisis has been averted, and the Election Commission of India has announced to hold elections to the Legislative Council, even though the country is currently battling a pandemic. The writer says that this decision of the Election Commission to hold elections to the Legislative Council on the 21st of May is a bold decision in order to preserve the democratic spirit of the elections. But the Election Commission is going to face a number of challenges while holding elections as a result of the pandemic and the need to enforce social distancing. The writer also says that it is far more easier to hold elections to a few seats of the Legislative Council as compared to the state elections that are scheduled throughout 2020 and 2021. And since the pandemic is here to stay for the next few years, the Election Commission would be forced to come up with innovative ways through which elections can be held while simultaneously adhering to the norms of social distancing and the principles of electoral democracy. Because see, holding state elections would be a real challenge to the Election Commission of India because it cannot postpone state elections indefinitely. The Constitution of India under Article 85 and Article 174 says that the maximum time limit between two sessions of the House or the Assembly can be 6 months. So this mandates the Election Commission to hold elections to state governments as soon as the term of the current government expires, because it has to ensure that a new government and a new legislature is in place within a period of 6 months. But however, the central government does have the option of postponing elections to states by making use of few special provisions under the Constitution. See, Article 172 of the Indian Constitution says that elections to a state government can be postponed by the centre provided if there is a national emergency in operation. But the centre may not be able to make use of this provision because national emergency can be imposed only when there is a threat to India's security and sovereignty. That is only when India is fighting a war or when it is dealing with an internal armed rebellion. The Constitution does not account for an epidemic or a pandemic, and a national emergency cannot be declared on these grounds. The second option for the central government would be to declare President's rule under Article 356 in states which are heading towards elections. But again, this provision is not viable for the central government because the Supreme Court has already placed a number of limits and boundaries on the application of Article 356. Because any such excessive interference by the central government in the conduct of state elections would violate the federal and democratic nature of the Indian polity. This is where the writer says that the Government of India and the Election Commission of India can draw lessons from South Korea. Because recently, South Korea successfully managed to hold elections despite having to deal with a pandemic and despite having to enforce social distancing norms. During these recent elections, South Korea ensured that all disinfection protocols and social distancing norms were followed during the elections. And according to the writer, this South Korean model could offer a lesson to the Election Commission of India. But of course, a cut copy paste of the South Korean model may not be applicable for a country like India, which is so diverse. So the Election Commission of India might also be forced to look at other voting options, such as proxy voting through postal votes and online votes. But to make this happen, the Election Commission of India would first have to put in place a well-established legal framework. So the writer says that either ways, the pandemic is going to change the nature of elections, and it would be the responsibility of the Election Commission of India to enforce social distancing while simultaneously upholding the democratic spirit of elections. Now let's take up an article from page number 8. The Indian Meteorological Department, or IMD, has started providing weather forecasts for cities in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, such as Gilgit Baltistan and Muzaffarabad. The provision of weather forecasts for Muzaffarabad in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and Gilgit Baltistan by IMD is very significant because it directly challenges the illegal occupation of these areas by Pakistan. See, this map over here represents the legitimate claims of India over Jammu and Kashmir. India's claims over J&K extends not only to the areas that are currently under its control, such as Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh, but it also extends to the Aksai Chin region that is currently under Chinese occupation, and it also extends to Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and Gilgit Baltistan that are currently under the illegal occupation of Pakistan. See, this move of India is quite significant because Pakistan is looking to hold elections to the Legislative Assembly of Gilgit Baltistan, which enjoys a semi-autonomous status, and Pakistan has been making attempts over the years to integrate Gilgit Baltistan as one of its provinces. Recently, the Supreme Court of Pakistan has directed the Pakistani government to hold legislative elections for Gilgit Baltistan in September 2020 and appoint a caretaker government for the time being. But this ruling of the Supreme Court of Pakistan and the stand of the Pakistani government has been repeatedly challenged by India because India has always maintained that Pakistan and its institutions have no locus standi as far as administration and elections in the POK region and Gilgit Baltistan are concerned. So this move by an Indian state agency such as IMD to provide weather forecasts for Gilgit Baltistan and Muzaffarabad sends out a symbolic message to Pakistan that India is reiterating its claims over the entire state of Jammu and Kashmir. Even though this doesn't change the ground realities, it does send out a strong symbolic message as far as India's intentions and claims are concerned. Now let's take up another article from page number 11, which deals with the Afghan peace process. See, the United States Special Representative for Afghanistan, Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad, has visited India and he has met with India's Foreign Minister and National Security Advisor. The objective of this visit of the US Special Representative is to take India on board with regard to the Afghan peace process and provide for the full implementation of the US-Taliban peace deal which was recently signed. During this interaction, the Indian side has expressed its concern with regard to increasing violence in Afghanistan after the peace deal has been signed, especially with regard to the targeting of minority communities such as Sikhs, Hindus, etc. And Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad has appreciated India's role in contributing to the reconstruction efforts of Afghanistan, and he has called upon India to support the US-Taliban peace deal and provide for the full implementation of the Afghan peace process. Now let's take up the practice questions. Who founded the Swadeshi Steam Navigation Company in order to challenge the monopoly of the British India Steam Navigation Company? The correct answer is option B. It was V.O.Chidambaram Pillai, who established the Swadeshi steam navigation company. This question has been asked because the 100 years ago article from page number 7 makes a reference to the contribution of V.O.Chidambaram Pillai to India's freedom struggle. See, V.O.Chidambaram Pillai was a key member of the Indian National Congress and played a very important role in India's freedom struggle. He was usually referred to as VOC through his initials, and he was popularly known as Kappalottiya Tamizhan, which roughly translates to the Tamizhan who drove the ship. In 1906, he established India's first shipping service, that is the Swadeshi Steam Navigation Company, in order to challenge the monopoly of the British India Steam Navigation Company. Through this company, V.O.Chidambaram Pillai launched India's first indigenous shipping service between Tuticorin and Colombo in order to compete against the shipping services provided by the British India Steam Navigation Company and break its monopoly. This is the reason why the Tuticorin Port Trust, which happens to be one of India's major ports, has been named after V.O.Chidambaram Pillai. And also note that V.O.Chidambaram Pillai was a lifelong disciple of Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and he was also closely associated with Mahatma Gandhi. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which UN agency has the mandate to work towards the improvement of reproductive and sexual health? The correct answer is option B, UNFPA. It stands for the United Nations Fund for Population Activities, or it is also known as the UN Population Fund. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 14, the World Health Organization and UNFPA have noted a 60% increase in domestic violence related calls in Europe during the lockdown period. Now let's take up the next practice question. The Very Large Telescope, a telescope facility operated by the European Southern Observatory, is located in Chile. Option C is the right answer. The Very Large Telescope is located in the Atacama Desert of Chile, and it is operated by the European Southern Observatory, which is an intergovernmental scientific organization involving a number of European countries. After the Hubble Space Telescope, which is based in space, the Very Large Telescope is considered to be one of the most significant ground-based facilities, which is contributing immensely to the field of astrophysics. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? A brown dwarf is a type of substellar object that is referred to as a failed star because its mass is in between those of the heaviest gas giant planets and the least massive stars. Lumen 16 is a binary brown dwarf system located in the Vela constellation, and it is the third closest star system to the Sun after Alpha Centauri and Barnard star. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. These two questions were asked because this article on page number 16 makes a reference to the brown dwarf star system and the Lumen 16 binary star system, which consists of Lumen 16A and Lumen 16B. See, brown dwarfs are basically failed stars whose mass falls in between that of a large gigantic gas planet and that of the smaller sequence stars. These brown dwarf stars are referred to as failed stars because they are unable to sustain nuclear fusion due to their small size, and hence they are unable to produce energy of their own. But however, some of the massive brown dwarfs, they are able to fuse deuterium or lithium in order to produce a faint glow. These brown dwarfs are usually covered by cloud bands, and an Indian astrophysicist, Mr. Sujan Sengupta, who works at the Indian Institute of Astrophysics in Bengaluru, had predicted that by studying the cloud bands of brown dwarf stars, we can study the environment of these failed stars. This idea of the Indian astrophysicist has been upheld by a team of international researchers who were making use of the Very Large Telescope in order to observe the Lumen 16 binary brown dwarf system. This star system, which is located in the Vela constellation, happens to be the third closest star system to the Sun after Alpha Centauri and the Barnard star. The Lumen 16 binary star system consists of two brown dwarfs, that is Lumen 16A and Lumen 16B. These researchers have identified their cloud bands, and this subsequently opens up the possibility to study their environments by studying their cloud bands. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Sundarbans Delta is spread over India and Bangladesh. It is the only mangrove forest in the world inhabited by tigers. It is a tiger reserve, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and as well as a Ramsar site. All the three statements are correct, so option D is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 16, the tiger population in the Sundarbans Tiger Reserve has increased to 96 according to the latest census. Now let us take up a practice question from the 2019 prelims paper. The Atal Innovation Mission is set up under the Niti Aayog. This is a pretty straightforward question, so option C is the right answer. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: chemical disasters can have a traumatic impact on human beings and as well as the environment. India has put in place a comprehensive disaster management plan to deal with such chemical disasters. Examine. The second question: holding elections during a pandemic raises several constitutional, legal and logistical challenges. Evaluate them from the perspective of the Election Commission of India. So kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.